Imagine being surrounded by enemy soldiers, completely outnumbered, with bullets flying past your head and explosions shaking the ground beneath your feet. Now imagine spotting an abandoned enemy tank just sitting there, keys still in the ignition. Most people would run, most people would hide, but Doug Bayard climbed inside that German Panzer and turned it into his own personal weapon of chaos against the very army that built it. This is the absolutely insane true story of how a Scottish mechanic with nerves of steel pulled off one of the most audacious stunts of World War II and somehow lived to tell the tale. April 1943, North Africa. The sun is beating down mercilessly on the Tunisian desert, turning the landscape into a furnace. British forces are locked in brutal combat with the Afrika Korps, and the fighting is getting more desperate by the day. This is the final act of the North African campaign, where Rommel's legendary Afrika Korps is making its last stand. Tanks are rolling, artillery is pounding, and men are dying in the scorching heat. In the middle of all this chaos is Doug Bayard, a 32-year-old sergeant in the Royal Electrical and Mechanical Engineers. Now, Doug isn't your typical frontline soldier. He's a mechanic. His job is to keep British tanks running, to fix what's broken, to make sure the armor keeps rolling forward. But on this particular day, Doug is about to step way outside his job description. The British 8th Army has been pushing hard against the German and Italian forces, trying to squeeze them into an ever-shrinking pocket of territory. The fighting around a place called WWII has been especially fierce. Tanks are getting knocked out left and right, vehicles are breaking down in the harsh conditions, and the mechanics like Doug are working around the clock just to keep the army mobile. But here's the thing about Doug Bayard that you need to understand. This man grew up in the industrial heartland of Scotland, working with machinery since he was practically a kid. He knows engines, he knows transmissions, he knows how mechanical things work, and more importantly, he knows how to make them work even when they shouldn't. That skill set is about to become very, very relevant. British forces have just captured a strategic position, pushing the Germans back in fierce fighting. The battlefield is littered with destroyed vehicles, abandoned equipment, and the general wreckage of mechanized warfare. Doug and his unit are moving through this mess, assessing what can be salvaged, what needs to be repaired, and what's beyond saving. And that's when Doug sees it. Sitting there, maybe 300 yards away, partially concealed behind a sand dune, is a German Panzer Mark III tank. It's just sitting there, no crew around it, no obvious signs of damage, just abandoned in the retreat. Now most people in Doug's position would report this finding and move on. Let the infantry secure it. Let intelligence examine it. Let someone higher up the chain of command decide what to do with captured enemy equipment. But Doug Bayard is looking at that tank with a completely different perspective. He's not seeing an enemy vehicle. He's seeing a machine that, if it runs, has a very functional cannon and multiple machine guns. A machine that could be incredibly useful in the fighting that's still raging not far from where they're standing. The gears in Doug's head are already turning. Could it still run? Could he get it started? Could he actually use this thing? His commanding officer is skeptical, to put it mildly. Using captured enemy equipment is risky for about a dozen different reasons. First, you don't know if it's been sabotaged. The retreating Germans might have disabled it, or worse, booby-trapped it. Second, even if it works, operating an unfamiliar vehicle in combat is asking for trouble. Third, and this is a big one, if you're driving around in a German tank, your own side might blow you to pieces before they realize you're friendly. British anti-tank gunners aren't going to stop and ask questions when they see a Panzer rolling toward them. They're going to shoot first and identify the wreckage later. But Doug is persistent. He argues that the tank could be incredibly valuable. The Germans are still putting up strong resistance, and every weapon counts. If he can get it running, they'd essentially be stealing a perfectly good tank from the enemy and using their own firepower against them. There's a beautiful irony to that idea. Finally, his officer gives him conditional permission. He can inspect the tank. If it looks operational, if it doesn't seem booby-trapped, he can attempt to start it. But the officer makes it very clear that this is on Doug. If something goes wrong, if the tank explodes, if he gets himself killed, that's his responsibility. Doug accepts these terms without hesitation. He grabs a couple of other mechanics who are curious enough or crazy enough to help him, and they start making their way toward the abandoned Panzer. Every step toward that tank is tense. They're moving through recently contested ground, which means there could still be snipers around, there could be mines, there could be German soldiers who didn't get the memo about retreating. And then there's the tank itself, which might be wired to explode the moment someone tries to open the hatch. Doug approaches carefully, examining the exterior first. He's looking for obvious signs of damage, for wires that shouldn't be there, for anything that seems off. The tank appears intact. No major shell holes, no blown treads, no visible reason why the crew would have abandoned it, except for the chaos of a hasty retreat. Maybe they ran out of fuel. Maybe they had mechanical trouble and didn't have time to fix it. Maybe the crew just panicked and fled. Whatever the reason, the Germans left behind a fully equipped medium tank, and Doug is about to see if he can make it his. He climbs onto the hull, heart pounding, knowing that this could be the moment everything goes wrong. He reaches the commander's hatch and pauses. This is the point of maximum danger. If there's a booby trap, it's probably rigged to this hatch. One wrong move and he's dead. Doug takes a breath and carefully, very carefully, opens it. Nothing explodes. No hidden grenades. No tripwires. The hatch swings open and Doug peers inside the tank's interior. It's cramped, it smells like diesel and sweat and metal, but it looks functional. He lowers himself inside, and now he's sitting in the commander's position of an enemy tank, surrounded by German instruments, German controls, German everything. The labels are all in German. The layout is different from British tanks, but machinery speaks a universal language to someone like Doug Bayard, and he's fluent in that language. He makes his way to the driver's position, squeezing through the tight interior. The fuel gauge shows there's still diesel in the tanks. Good sign. He checks the basic systems, looking for anything obviously broken or disconnected. Everything seems to be in order. The big question is the engine. Will it turn over? Has it been sitting here long enough to seize up? Is there internal damage they can't see? Doug knows that Panzer Mark III tanks use a Maybach engine, a good reliable motor if it's been maintained properly. He primes the fuel system, checks that the transmission is in neutral, and reaches for the starter. This is the moment. If the engine has been sabotaged, if there's a bomb wired to the ignition, if the Germans did anything to prevent this tank from being used against them, Doug is about to find out in the worst possible way. He hits the starter. The engine groans, turns over once, twice, struggling to come to life after sitting idle. And then, with a throaty roar and a belch of black smoke from the exhaust, the Maybach engine catches and rumbles to life. The whole tank vibrates with mechanical power. Doug can feel the engine's rhythm through the driver's seat. This thing actually runs. Against all odds, despite being abandoned on a battlefield, this German Panzer is operational. Doug allows himself a moment of triumph, but only a moment, because now comes the really crazy part. Now he has to actually use this thing. He familiarizes himself with the controls. The steering system on a Panzer is different from British tanks, using a steering wheel instead of levers, which actually makes it a bit easier to drive once you get used to it. The gearbox is straightforward enough. The real challenge is coordinating with the rest of the crew positions. A tank isn't meant to be operated by one person. You need a driver, a gunner, a loader, a commander. Doug has a couple of other guys with him, mechanics who are willing to help, but who have exactly zero training in tank gunnery or operation. They're about to get a very rapid education in German armor operation. Doug manages to get the tank moving, carefully at first, getting a feel for how it handles. The Panzer Mark III weighs about 23 tons, and it's got reasonable mobility for its size. He drives it back toward British lines, but here's where things get extremely dangerous. He's now driving a German tank toward British positions. Every anti-tank gun crew in the area sees him as a legitimate target. Doug and his makeshift crew are waving British flags out of the hatches, shouting, doing everything they can to signal that this is a friendly vehicle, not an enemy attack. There are definitely some tense moments where British gunners are tracking them, fingers on triggers, deciding whether to open fire. But somehow, through a combination of frantic waving, radio communication from other units, and sheer luck, they make it back to British lines without getting blown to pieces by their own side. Once they're safely back, Doug gets official permission to actually use the tank in combat. The British forces are still pushing forward, still fighting to break through the remaining German defenses, and a tank is a tank. Doesn't matter whose flag it originally flew under. Doug and his crew spend some time really learning the vehicle, figuring out the weapons systems, the ammunition storage, the communication equipment. The Panzer Mark III is armed with a 50mm main gun and 2 machine guns, one coaxial and one in the hull. It's a decent amount of firepower. The armor is reasonably thick for a medium tank, though it won't stand up to a direct hit from heavier British guns. But it's a fully functional combat vehicle, and now it's fighting for the Allies. Over the next several days, Doug Bayard uses that captured Panzer in actual combat operations. Think about how absolutely surreal this is. Here's a Scottish mechanic who was never trained as a tanker, driving a German tank, shooting German positions with German ammunition, using German equipment against German soldiers. The psychological impact on the German troops who see this must have been incredible. Imagine being a German soldier, dug in, defending your position, and you see a Panzer coming toward you. For a split second, you think it's reinforcements. You think help has arrived, and then that Panzer opens fire on you. The confusion alone must have been devastating. Doug uses the tank primarily for infantry support, using the machine guns to suppress enemy positions and the main gun to take out fortified points. The Panzer performs well, and Doug's natural mechanical skill means he can keep it running even when minor issues crop up. He's constantly maintaining it, fixing little problems, keeping the engine tuned. He treats that captured tank better than some crews treated their own assigned vehicles. And the tank keeps running, keeps fighting, keeps being this bizarre reverse Trojan horse situation where the enemy's own weapon is being used against them. The news of what Doug has done spreads through the British ranks. Soldiers love this kind of story. In the middle of a brutal, grinding campaign where men are exhausted and morale can be fragile, here's this mechanic who just decided to steal an enemy tank and use it like it was his own. It's exactly the kind of audacious, slightly insane action that becomes legendary among troops. Other units hear about it. Officers hear about it. Eventually, it makes its way up the chain of command to people with enough rank to either punish Doug for his unauthorized appropriation of enemy equipment or recognize him for his initiative and resourcefulness. Fortunately for Doug, the higher-ups see the value in what he's done. He's taken a risk, absolutely, but it paid off. He's added a functional tank to British forces without costing them anything, and he's used it effectively in combat. That kind of initiative is exactly what the military wants to encourage, even if it's highly irregular. Doug's actions also highlight a broader truth about the North African campaign. This is mechanized warfare in an incredibly harsh environment, and the side that can keep more vehicles running has a massive advantage. Doug's skills as a mechanic are just as valuable as any frontline soldier's combat skills, maybe more so. An army without working vehicles is just a bunch of guys standing in the desert. Doug keeps things moving. The captured Panzer continues to see action as the British push further into Tunisia. The end of the North African campaign is approaching. The Germans and Italians are being compressed into an ever-shrinking area, their backs to the Mediterranean, nowhere to retreat. The fighting is fierce because the Axis forces know they're trapped. Every position is defended desperately. Every meter of ground is contested. And through all of this, Doug Bayard is driving that German tank, supporting British infantry advances, proving that sometimes the best weapon to use against your enemy is the one they gave you. Eventually, the Panzer sustains enough damage that it's no longer combat effective. Maybe it takes a hit from German anti-tank fire, which would be another layer of irony. Maybe it just breaks down beyond field repair after being used hard in combat conditions. The sources don't specify exactly how Doug's adventure with the captured tank ended, but by May 1943, the North African campaign is over. German and Italian forces surrender en masse, over 250,000 troops taken prisoner. The Allies control North Africa, and the stage is set for the invasion of Italy. Doug Bayard survives the war. He goes home to Scotland, back to civilian life, carrying with him one of the most unusual war stories you could imagine. While other soldiers talk about the battles they fought, the places they saw, the hardships they endured, Doug gets to tell people he stole a German tank and used it in combat. It's the kind of story that sounds too crazy to be true, except it absolutely is true. There are records of this happening, documentation of the captured Panzer being used by British forces, verification that a mechanic named Doug Bayard was the one who made it all happen. What makes Doug's story so compelling isn't just the audacity of what he did, it's what it reveals about the nature of warfare and the kind of people who fight in wars. Most of the focus in military history goes to the generals, the grand strategies, the big picture movements of armies across maps. But wars are actually won by individuals making decisions in moments of chaos. Doug Bayard didn't have time to wait for orders from high command. He didn't have the luxury of a committee meeting to discuss the pros and cons of using captured equipment. He saw an opportunity, he assessed the risks, and he took action. That kind of initiative, repeated by thousands of soldiers making their own decisions in their own moments, is what actually determines the outcome of battles. There's also something beautifully subversive about Doug's story. The whole machinery of war is built on the idea of sides, of us versus them, of weapons designed to kill the enemy. But a machine doesn't care who's operating it. That Panzer didn't know it was supposed to be fighting for Germany. It just knew it had fuel, ammunition, and someone who could drive it. Doug recognized that fundamental truth. He looked past the markings and the national identity stamped onto that tank and saw it for what it was, a tool. And like any good mechanic, he knew how to use the right tool for the job. The psychological aspect of Doug's action is worth considering too. Military morale is a fragile thing, especially in a campaign as brutal as North Africa. Soldiers are hot, tired, scared, watching their friends die, wondering if they're going to be next. And then they hear about some crazy Scottish mechanic who just climbed into a German tank and started blowing up German positions with it. That kind of story does wonders for morale. It's funny, it's unexpected. It's the little guy giving the middle finger to the enemy in the most literal way possible. It reminds soldiers that they're not just cogs in a machine, that individual action still matters, that audacity and courage can make a difference. From a military effectiveness standpoint, what Doug did also highlights the importance of technical knowledge in modern warfare. World War II was the first truly mechanized global conflict. Tanks, trucks, aircraft, all of these machines required people who understood how to maintain them, repair them, and keep them operational in terrible conditions. A brilliant infantry tactician is useless if his tanks won't start. A bold strategic plan falls apart if the trucks carrying supplies break down. The mechanics, the engineers, the technicians, these people don't get the glory, but they're absolutely essential. Doug Bayard was one of these essential people, and his particular set of skills allowed him to do something that a regular infantry soldier couldn't have done. He understood machines well enough to trust his own judgment about that abandoned Panzer, to know he could get it running, to know he could operate it effectively. There's a broader lesson here about resourcefulness in general. War strips away a lot of the normal rules and structures of society. In civilian life, you can't just take something that doesn't belong to you, even if you could make better use of it than the current owner. But in war, especially in the chaos of a combat zone, the normal rules don't apply. What matters is effectiveness, survival, accomplishing the mission. Doug understood that. He saw a resource that could help his side win, and he took it. That kind of adaptability, that willingness to operate outside normal procedures when the situation demands it, is a crucial trait for anyone in a crisis situation, military or otherwise. The fact that Doug survived his tank adventure is worth noting too. This could easily have gone wrong in so many ways. He could have been killed by a booby trap when he opened the tank. The engine could have been sabotaged, exploding when he started it. The tank could have broken down in the middle of a combat zone, leaving him stranded and vulnerable. British anti-tank crews could have blown him to pieces before realizing he was friendly. German forces could have targeted the tank, not knowing it was being operated by the enemy. Any one of a dozen things could have killed Doug Bayard during this adventure, but none of them did. Some combination of skill, caution, and luck kept him alive. He assessed the risks, took reasonable precautions, and managed to pull off something incredibly dangerous without getting himself killed in the process. After the war, Doug went back to his life, but he'd been part of something enormous. The North African campaign was a turning point in World War II. It was the first major theater where the Allies definitively defeated German forces, ending the myth of German invincibility. The victory in North Africa led directly to the invasion of Italy, which tied down German forces and resources that could have been used elsewhere. It gave the Allies crucial experience in amphibious operations and combined arms warfare that would be essential for D-Day. And in some tiny way, Doug Bayard's captured Panzer contributed to all of that. It was one tank, operated by a makeshift crew for a relatively short period, but it added to the pressure on German forces, it supported British advances, it was part of the massive collective effort that won the campaign. Stories like Doug's remind us that history isn't just made by the famous names we all know. For every Churchill or Eisenhower making decisions in comfortable offices, there are thousands of people like Doug Bayard making their own decisions in dusty, dangerous places, decisions that don't make it into the official histories, but that collectively determine the outcome of events. The mechanic who keeps the tanks running, the cook who keeps the soldiers fed, the medic who saves wounded men, the radio operator who maintains communication. All of these people are essential to the war effort, even if their names never become famous. There's something very human about Doug's story too. He wasn't superhuman. He wasn't a specially trained commando or an elite soldier. He was a mechanic. He was good at his job, he was brave enough to take a risk, and he was smart enough to recognize an opportunity when he saw one. Those are traits that any of us could have. We all like to think that in extreme circumstances, we'd rise to the occasion, that we'd be brave, that we'd do the right thing. Doug Bayard actually did it. When the moment came, he didn't freeze, he didn't second-guess himself into inaction, he didn't play it safe. He climbed into that German tank, and he made it work. The story also illustrates the strange intimacy of mechanized warfare. Doug spent days inside that Panzer, learning its quirks, understanding its strengths and weaknesses, maintaining it. In a weird way, he probably developed a kind of affection for it, the way people who work with machines often do. It kept him alive, it performed well, it did what he needed it to do. The fact that it was built by the enemy becomes almost irrelevant. The tank itself is neutral. It's just metal and engineering. Doug made it serve his purposes, and in doing so, he turned an enemy asset into a friendly one through nothing more than skill and audacity. What would have happened if more soldiers had Doug's mechanical knowledge and willingness to improvise? How much captured equipment could have been turned against its original owners if there were more people willing and able to operate it? These are interesting questions. In practice, using captured equipment was relatively rare because of the risks involved and the logistical complications. It's much easier to supply and maintain vehicles when they're all the same type, using the same parts and ammunition. Captured enemy equipment is a nightmare for supply officers. But in specific situations, like Doug's, where you have someone with the skills to operate captured gear and the immediate tactical need for it, the benefits can outweigh the complications. Doug's story spread beyond just military circles after the war. It became one of those tales that gets told and retold, sometimes embellished, sometimes simplified, but always maintaining that core of absolute audacity. A mechanic stole an enemy tank and used it in combat. The basic facts of that sentence are inherently dramatic. You don't need to add much to make it compelling. The story does the work itself. And because it's true, because it actually happened, it has a power that fiction can't quite match. Someone really did this. It's not a movie plot. It's not creative exaggeration. WWII really climbed into that Panzer and really used it to fight Germans. In the decades since World War II, there have been other instances of soldiers using captured enemy equipment, but few as dramatically as Doug's story. The circumstances have to be just right. Abandoned equipment that still works, someone with the skills to operate it, a tactical situation where using it makes sense, and the courage to actually do it despite the risks. It's a rare combination. Most captured equipment is either destroyed, studied for intelligence purposes, or sent to the rear for evaluation. It rarely ends up being used in active combat by the capturing force. Doug's situation was unique, and his response to it was equally unique. The British military recognized Doug's achievement, though probably not with the level of public fanfare that such a story deserves. Military bureaucracies are conservative institutions, and doing something as irregular as commandeering an enemy tank doesn't always fit neatly into the categories for commendations and medals. But among his fellow soldiers, among the people who understood what he'd done and how difficult and dangerous it was, Doug was respected. That peer recognition, that acknowledgement from people who were there and who know, is often more meaningful than official awards anyway. Doug's mechanical expertise was the key to everything. Without his years of experience working with engines and machinery, he wouldn't have been able to assess whether the Panzer was functional, wouldn't have known how to start it, wouldn't have been able to keep it running. Skill matters, knowledge matters. The hours Doug spent as a young man in Scotland, learning his trade, working with machines, developing that intuitive understanding of how mechanical systems work, all of that paid off in the Tunisian desert in 1943. You never know when seemingly ordinary skills are going to become extraordinarily valuable. Doug probably didn't imagine, when he was learning to be a mechanic, that one day his life would depend on being able to start a German tank under combat conditions. But that's exactly what happened. There's a beautiful simplicity to the core of this story. Doug saw something useful. He figured out how to make it work. He used it to help his side. Strip away all the context, all the historical significance, all the analysis, and that's what it comes down to. Problem solving under pressure, taking initiative, making things work. These are universal human qualities, and WWII had them in abundance. He's the kind of person you'd want on your side in any crisis. The kind of person who doesn't just complain about problems, but actually tries to solve them. The image of a Scottish mechanic driving a German tank into battle is almost comically incongruous, which is part of why the story is so memorable. It shouldn't have worked. By all reasonable expectations, Doug should have reported the abandoned tank to his superiors and moved on with his regular duties. The tank should have been booby-trapped or disabled. Even if it ran, Doug shouldn't have been able to operate it effectively without proper training. British forces should have fired on it, mistaking it for an enemy vehicle. The whole chain of events that led to Doug successfully using that Panzer is so improbable that if you encountered it in fiction, you'd think it was unrealistic. But reality doesn't care about being realistic. Sometimes the most improbable things happen because someone is brave enough and skilled enough to make them happen. WWII passed away years after the war, having lived a full life beyond his moment of military fame. He wasn't a career soldier. He served when his country needed him, did his duty with exceptional skill and courage, and then went back to being a civilian. That's the story of millions of World War II veterans. They weren't professional warriors. They were ordinary people who found themselves in extraordinary circumstances and rose to meet them. Doug's particular method of rising to the occasion was more unusual than most, but the underlying principle is the same. When the moment demands it, ordinary people can do extraordinary things. The legacy of Doug's action isn't just the story itself, though that's entertaining enough. It's what the story represents about human adaptability and courage. We are capable of amazing things when we are pushed to it. We can learn new skills quickly when we need to. We can take enormous risks when the situation demands it. We can look at the resources available to us, even if those resources were originally intended for our enemies, and figure out how to use them to our advantage. These are the qualities that have allowed humans to survive and thrive in every environment on Earth. And Doug Bayard's adventure with a German tank is just one small example of those qualities in action. If you were making a movie about Doug Bayard, you'd probably be tempted to add in more drama, more explosions, more close calls. But the real story is dramatic enough. The tension of approaching that abandoned tank, not knowing if it's booby-trapped, the moment when Doug opens the hatch and nothing explodes, the engine coughing to life after sitting idle, the nerve-wracking drive back to British lines, waiting for friendly fire to end everything. The surreal experience of fighting your enemies with their own equipment. You don't need to embellish any of that. The truth is compelling enough on its own merits. What Doug did required a specific combination of technical skill, physical courage, and mental audacity. He needed the technical skill to assess and operate the tank. He needed the physical courage to expose himself to danger by approaching and entering an abandoned enemy vehicle in a combat zone. And he needed the mental audacity to even conceive of the idea in the first place, to look at that Panzer and think, I could use that, instead of just seeing it as enemy equipment to be avoided or destroyed. Not everyone has all three of those qualities, and even people who do have them might not deploy them at the right moment. Doug did, and that's why his story is worth telling. In the grand sweep of World War II, Doug Bayard's captured Panzer was a tiny footnote. It didn't change the outcome of any major battle. It didn't alter the strategic situation. The North African campaign would have ended the same way with or without Doug's tank adventure, but that doesn't make it meaningless. Individual human stories matter, even when they don't change history. They matter because they're true, because they happen to real people, because they reveal something about the human experience. Doug's story reveals courage, ingenuity, and the kind of practical problem-solving that often goes unrecognized, but that's essential to how things actually get done in the real world. The men who served with Doug, who saw what he did, who benefited from the fire support of that captured Panzer, they knew how impressive it was. They understood the risks he took and the skill required to pull it off. Their respect and admiration for Doug's action is probably more meaningful than any medal or official recognition. These were men who were also facing danger every day, who understood combat intimacy, who could recognize genuine courage when they saw it. When your peers, people who are in the same situation as you, acknowledge that you did something exceptional, that means something profound. There's a timeless quality to Doug's story. You could place it in any era where mechanized warfare exists, and it would still be compelling. The specifics change, the technology evolves, but the basic situation remains. A skilled individual recognizing an opportunity, taking a risk, and using enemy resources against them. It's the kind of story that militaries love because it exemplifies initiative and adaptability. It's the kind of story civilians love because it's dramatic and unexpected. And it's the kind of story that's worth preserving because it reminds us that history is made by individuals, by people making choices in specific moments, not just by impersonal forces and inevitable trends. Doug Bayard wasn't trying to become famous. He wasn't performing for an audience. He was just doing what seemed like the right thing to do in that moment. He saw a tank that could be useful, and he made it useful. The fact that his action became a memorable story was almost incidental to his purpose. He was focused on the immediate tactical situation, on helping his unit, on contributing to the mission. The legendary status came later, built on the foundation of a simple act of courage and competence. That's often how the best stories work. They're not constructed or performed. They just emerge from people trying to do their jobs well under difficult circumstances. If there's a lesson to take from Doug Bayard's story, it's probably this: expertise combined with courage can achieve remarkable things. Doug had the expertise to understand tanks and engines. He had the courage to put that expertise into practice in a dangerous situation. Either quality alone wouldn't have been enough. Expertise without courage would have meant he recognized the opportunity but didn't take it. Courage without expertise would have gotten him killed when he tried to operate equipment he didn't understand. But the combination of both allowed him to accomplish something genuinely extraordinary. That's a pattern worth recognizing in all areas of life, not just military service. The people who make real differences are usually those who combine deep knowledge in their field with the willingness to take risks when necessary. Doug Bayard, a Scottish mechanic, stole a German tank in the middle of the North African desert and used it to fight against the very army that built it. He survived the war, went home, and lived out his life, carrying one of the most improbable war stories imaginable. In a conflict that killed millions of people and devastated entire continents, Doug's small act of audacity stands out as a reminder that individual courage and ingenuity still matter, that one person making a bold decision can still make a difference, and that sometimes the best weapon you can use against your enemy is the one they accidentally left behind for you to find. That's the story of Doug Bayard and his stolen Panzer, a tale of mechanical skill, nerves of steel, and the kind of bold action that turns ordinary soldiers into legends.